So for part one, let's do a little bit of review. Last week we talked about libraries and how they have lots of books, and we're trying to figure out how do we handle all these books, what's the best approach for this, and so we kind of said let's break it down and identify the entities or objects or tables that we may need. So we started out by saying, hey, we have a book, and books have all these properties. Things like titles and authors and ISBN numbers and publishers. So we said, let's just kind of start there. So we went through and we built a table. We identified an ID column as a primary key, and then we did an author, title, ISBN, page count, Dewey Decimal, publisher, topics, and copyright. So that was kind of where we started. And then we came up with this kind of fake table of data just to give us a perspective. And that all looked good. And then we started to expand on the book and said there's additional entities that we need to look at. So we started talking about authors, and we have loaners, the people that are actually borrowing the books, and how they're all kind of related together. So then we kept going down that path and saying, well, if we have authors, we should create a table for authors. And that author table looks something like this. First name, last name. We came up with additional things. Birth date, publisher, location. Probably not real authentic, but it was something to go with. Then we came up with a fake kind of set of table data to understand how that data would be structured in the table. So then we said, okay, so if books are related to authors, how do we actually fit these two together? And we came up and said, okay, there's an author column in the books table, we have an author table, maybe we should make these more related. So we changed it up and said author underscore ID in the books table, and then that ID would link back to the appropriate author. So if we had 2 or 3 books together and they were all written by the same author, then that would have become a relational reference that would become a primary key to foreign key relationship. Primary key coming from the author because that's the primary key or identity field for the author table. The foreign key being author underscore ID in the books table. So we have those relationships now, so whenever we create a new book by the same author, we would fill in the columns of data in the book table, and then we would reference the same ID from the author table to say this author also wrote this book. And that gives us a lot of power. We can turn around then and say we want author Kevin Gantos, as if I ever wrote a book. And then we could say select all from books, join on author, where author's last name is Gantos, and it would actually bring us back all of the books by that author. Now, if you had multiple authors, you'd get into some need to additionally clarify things, but that gives you a great starting point. So we kind of dummied that up a little bit and said, hey, let's see what that would look like, and this is the result set from that type of a select statement. So that's kind of where we started, or where we went to last week. And the assignment for last week was to do a few things. One was to think about this concept and look for it in the real world. And then more specifically, it was to take this concept and really jump forward with it. Try to find the loaner table. Try to identify the columns needed for the loaner table. Try to start to piece in how that relationship would look. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to switch. I'm going to go to SQL Server. And we're going to go through and actually build out both the books table, the authors table, and we'll start to discuss the loaners table and kind of figure out what all of that should look and feel like. So inside of SQL Server, if you're not familiar already, you have a lot of different components. And now what I've done is I've actually already connected. So I'm going to back out one step. When you open up SQL Management Studio, which is Start, SQL Management Studio, Enter, and that'll launch SQL Management Studio. Obviously, I already have it up. So you'll get prompted with something like this. It's a connect to server. So the type of server is going to be a database engine. There's additional types under here, but we're going to be using the engine specifically. Database name is the name of the server that you're connecting to. For me, I'm connecting to my local machine, so I represent that with a dot or a period. It can also be represented with the word localhost, or SQL has a custom notation of doing parenthesis local close parenthesis. Then there's a slash. Now the slash in the part that comes after the slash is actually optional, but that's identifying what's called an instance of your server. So you can actually run multiple SQL engines on the same physical machine. They each get a named instance. So you can have the default instance with no name, or for us, we have one that's called SQL Express. Your installation, depending on how you installed it and how you went about doing that setup, you could just simply be connecting to /local. If you downloaded Express, you may be /SQL Express, or it may be something entirely different if you chose to give it a name. If you have challenges with figuring out how to connect to your local instance, let me know and I can walk you through some steps on doing that. So from there, I'm going to use Windows Authentication. Since I'm running on my own local machine, I can just use my current user. If you were connecting to a remote machine, often you'll use SQL Server Authentication, which is just a username and password that's provided to you by the DBA or the current local admin, and that would be how you connect. So then you hit Connect, and Management Studio connects. Hopefully that's a little review for you. It shouldn't be new. You should have been doing it all in DB1, but just as a quick refresher in case you did have any questions or concerns. Now from there we have databases. I've got a lot of different databases. Specifically what we're going to do is we're going to create a new database. So I'm going to right click on databases and I'm going to choose new. And this database will be given a set of properties. So we start with the name, and I'm going to call this DB2 library. And you'll see down here that Management Studio goes ahead and actually sets up those database files that are needed. So we have two sets of files. We have the row data file, which is where everything gets persisted, and then we have a log file. And that log file is actually the temp space where transactions occur. And those files are stored depending the location where they're stored, I should say, depends on how your server is configured. So for me, mine will be stored under Program Files, Microsoft SQL Server, MS SQL 11.SQL Express /MS SQL /data. So that will be where my actual files are created. Now, the rows data file has a .mdf extension, MDF, Mary, David, Frank. And the log file has an LDF, Larry, David, Frank. And the MDF file, again, is the file where all of your data persists. So once you actually save and write data back to the disk, that's where all of it goes. So that's going to be the most important file that you have, is that MDF file. So we'll want to go ahead then and click OK. And Management Studio will go ahead and spin up that database for us. And there it is, DB2-library. And then we'll go ahead and just kind of twirl that open and take a look here. And if we open up things like tables and views, we'll see that there's some system table folders and some system view folders. Ooh, lots of system views. But there's no actual tables for us to work with. So that's our job, is to then create those tables. So I'm going to go ahead and right click on tables. Right click on tables and hit new table. And it pops up and it says, hey, what do you want to make your columns for this table? So I'm going to do a quick side by side. I'm going to bring back our PowerPoint slides and kind of work these also side by side. So now we can look at both at the same time. And specifically, I want to look at my column definitions. And what I'm going to do right now is pretty much just a one-for-one copy. I'm going to take what's on the right side and add it to the left. So we're going to have an ID column. That'll be an integer. It's going to be required, so the checkbox for allow nulls needs to be unchecked. Nulls means no value. We're not going to allow it to be of no value. It is required. I'm going to also then click on this little arrow to the left of the column, right click and say set as primary key. That will then make it our primary key field. Last thing I'm going to do, and there's a lot of steps to get the primary key set up, is down here under column properties. I'm going to scroll down. I'm going to look for the property called identity specification. I'm going to twirl that open, and then there's an option that says is identity. I'm going to change this to yes. And then what that does is it sets up the auto increment or auto number for that column, and that ensures that as we add rows, that column will automatically number up 1, 2, 3, and so forth. So then I'm going to kind of just go through here in a title, and then for a title or any string, you'll probably want to use either a varchar field, and you can set specific lengths to that, or you can also set it as a max. Or the other option is an nvarchar, and that has to do with the character set that you're choosing to use. Varchar follows along the typical ASCII English characters. Nvarchar gives you a whole bunch more characters, it also includes international characters and things of that nature. So if you're building a system that's more international, that allows things like Arabic text, Chinese text, as well as English Roman numbers and letters, um, then what you'll want to do is go with an nvarchar. For ours, I'm just going to localize it to the United States and other English, and I don't even know what the actual English letters, what kind of name they have, but just going with the typical alphabet letters. Alright, so then this is actually an older slide. Let me go to our latest. Oh, and come back over on this side. So author is now an author ID. So I'm going to go author underscore ID with an int because it's now an integer. Not allowing nulls on either one of those, by the way. ISBN will be a varchar, and I think there's a fixed length, but I'm going to go with 200 just to be safe. Not allowing nulls on that. Page count, it will be an integer as well, not optional. Dewey Decimal, and we're going to make that a string, so we'll say varchar 100, probably overkill, but we're going to go ahead and allow that to be null. And then we'll make a publisher, and that will be a varchar 100 as well. And we'll allow that to be null. Topics, that's going to be varchar, and I don't know what that's going to be, so I'm going to make it a max and make it nullable. And then the copyright, we're going to choose date time, and I'm actually going to go with date time 2. And the reason for that is that datetime 2 is a newer version. It's more compatible with the datetime data type that's used in a lot of programming languages. There's a more of a parity between the two, and it's just a better option to use. There's nothing wrong with the original datetime, but you just get better parity in terms of precision with datetime 2. Alright, so we'll go ahead and then save that. So we can click save here, or do Control S, or go file and save. And then it prompts us and says, what's the name of this table? And we're going to call it books. So we'll go ahead and hit enter. And now the books table officially has been created. To view that, we can go over here to tables on the Object Explorer and hit the refresh. And we'll pop up with a dbo.books. So let's go through then and do the same thing quickly with authors. So for authors, we'll have an ID. It'll be an integer, not allowing nulls. We're going to right click and set it as a primary key. Go through and find that identity specification and set the isIdentity to true. And then go through and fill out the rest of our fields. So we'll do a varchar 100, not allowing nulls. Last name, varchar 100 again. No nulls. The birth date will be a datetime 2. And publisher location will be varchar, and we'll go with a max here. And we'll allow that to be null. So we'll go ahead and save, and we'll call this the authors table. So now we have both the books and the authors table. So with both of those in place, now we're going to go ahead and implement the loaners table. So going back into our earlier conversation and looking at loaner, we came up with these properties. So instead of creating a slide and going through the mechanics, let's go ahead and just do it right inside of SQL. So a loaner, we're going to start out again with an ID. That'll be an integer, not allowing nulls. Set that identity to yes. Right click, set as primary key. So now we've set up our primary key. And then let's just kind of go around the circle and set up those properties. So we have first name, varchar 100. That should not be null. Last name, again, varchar 100. And these lengths are honestly up to personal preference. There's no right or wrong way of doing it. It's just around the idea of, you know, is it sufficient to store what you need, but not so big that you end up in a situation where you are just essentially allocating space that you never use. So the address, we'll do a varchar. An address is kind of ambiguous, and we'll talk more about that in later lectures. But for now, let's go ahead and go with the 300 character for address, and that should not be null. We have a library card number, and we'll make that a varchar as well, in case we do alphanumerics. And that probably won't exceed 50 characters, so we'll stay with that. Birth date, Date time 2, want to capture that. Gender, we'll go ahead with a char of 1 for now, and we'll figure out we may need to adjust that or change it in some way. The age will be an integer. We'll want to capture that. Phone number, we're going to treat that as a varchar, and phone numbers are typically 10 characters, 12 if you include international, so we'll go ahead and do 20 just to be safe. We will make that nullable. And then education, we'll go ahead and just do that of varchar 50 as well for now and leave that nullable. So that basically goes through and constructs the loaner table. Now obviously there's a lot of changes that we could make to this. We could probably extract or find additional relationships that would actually make this more efficient, and we'll talk more about normalization of tables in later lectures. So that is essentially the setup of the loaner table. From here, the one thing that I do want to add to this is that there is much more work that we could do here. What we have here is just the starting point of a loaner table, and we'll talk more about that next.